"Shut up, Mom. Nobody cares." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed hard and clean, right in the soft center of me, in front of 12 people and a table set like a magazine cover, thin crystal glasses, lacquered turkey, candles trembling with gentle golden light. My daughter didn't even look at me when she said it. She just kept cutting her roast, wrist loose and elegant, like she was brushing away a fly. The room went still, but only for a breath. A single fork slipped from someone's fingers and clinked against a plate. Someone coughed into their napkin. A child whispered to another child. Then the laughter resumed. Not directed at me, just around me. Like I wasn't there, like I had never been there. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I could feel my pulse in my wrists, slow, too slow, the kind of slow that comes right before something inside you goes quiet. I had been telling a memory, just a small one, about her father, the man who used to whistle while he cooked, the man she once cried for in her sleep. But she didn't want the memory. She wanted space. Space from me. The dining room smelled of cinnamon and sage and expensive red wine. Warmth everywhere, except inside my chest. I placed my napkin beside my plate, smooth, careful, no tremor. I stood. No one stopped me. Not even her. "I'm stepping out," I said softly to no one in particular. No one asked where. The dining room rug was thick beneath my shoes as I walked down the hallway. The door clicked shut behind me, gentle as a sigh. Outside, the wind was cold enough to sting. Leaves scraped across the driveway. The porch light flickered. Somewhere, a dog barked. Life continued. I sat in my car but didn't start it. I just sat, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the dark window where my reflection looked like a ghost someone forgot to bury. Inside, behind the glass, their laughter swelled again. It wasn't the insult that broke me. It was the ease with which she discarded me, like I was background noise, like my presence was clutter. The kind of ease people only have when they believe you'll never leave. I pressed the key into the ignition. The engine hummed. The road opened before me, silent, dark, endless. I didn't cry. Not one tear. The pain didn't rise. It settled. Heavy, precise, sharpening itself quietly. That was the moment, this exact one, when something inside me shifted. Not rage, recognition. She thought my silence was weakness. She forgot where her foundation came from. She forgot who built the ground beneath her feet. I drove home in perfect, calm stillness. And by the time I reached my front door, I already knew. I was done being small in the house I paid for. There's a hum to love, a quiet hum that no one really hears unless they're close enough to feel it. It's the sound of the unseen, of the unnoticed, of sacrifices made and never acknowledged. It's the hum of years spent building a life for someone who never even asked. When Corinne was 12, I woke up every morning at 4 a.m. to work the pharmacy shift at Christ Hospital. I walked to work because the bus fare was better spent on her. The smell of antiseptic clung to my skin like a second layer. By the time I returned home, she was usually in bed, but I'd make sure to leave a note telling her I loved her. And when she woke up, I made sure she didn't know the truth. The truth was I was tired, and more tired, but I wore my exhaustion like a second skin because she needed me to. I wanted her to live in a home that felt safe, not sacrificed. I learned to slice time into pieces, mothering, working, surviving. I remember one night coming home to find her asleep at the dining table with her textbooks spread around her like fallen wings. I kissed her forehead. She stirred and mumbled, "I'll make you proud, Mama." I thought she meant it. Back then, love was simple. Her face was a map of my dreams, her hands a quiet testament to all the work I put in. When she was little, I lived for those moments. The gentle weight of her in my arms, her soft voice asking for stories before bed, her laughter, the kind that spilled out of her like sunlight, full of life. But then the world began to shift. High school came, college applications, dreams that needed funding. I worked longer hours, knitted scarves at night to sell at church bazaars, sold my wedding ring, quietly, without ceremony. The ring sale wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was pretending I never owned one. Corinne was accepted into a prestigious business school, a school we couldn't afford, but I signed the loans, stacked debt like bricks, and told myself love was worth interest. She called home less. Holidays came and went. I learned to get comfortable with the sound of my own footsteps, the absence of her voice, her face becoming a silhouette in my mind. I remembered the days she graduated. She didn't look for me in the crowd. She looked for her future. I told myself that was normal. Growth looks like distance, or so I believed. But what they never tell you about distance is how heavy it gets. The further they grow, the more you shrink. And it's not their fault, not entirely. I taught her how to look away. I taught her how to want more. I taught her how to need less. When she came home with Adrian, I smiled, but it wasn't the same smile anymore. The one that could hide the exhaustion, the quiet resentments that had built up in my chest, the feeling that I was becoming more of a guest than a mother. They moved into my house temporarily, but nothing about them ever felt temporary. They were the perfect couple. And I was just here. At first, it wasn't bad. The occasional comment about how I could update the house or how I could let them do things. I nodded, smiled, and stepped back. But as time went on, the dismissals became more ordinary. Small slights, disregard for the things I had built with my hands, my sweat, my sacrifices. One afternoon, I overheard my granddaughter say, "Grandma talks too much," in the same tone a child uses to complain about the weather. It stung, but I didn't say anything. Silence can be love, but sometimes silence is letting the knife in deeper. And so I stayed silent. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because I had nothing left to say. My silence became my cloak, my armor, but it was not impenetrable. Slowly, it began to unravel. Corinne never knew the truth. She never knew that the smile I gave her when I handed her that acceptance letter was the same smile that hid years of late-night shifts, the ones where I left my tired body slumped in the corner of the pharmacy watching the clock tick slowly towards morning. She never knew that the loans I signed, the debts I took on, were a weight I carried silently, believing that one day she would look at me and see more than just her mother. She had dreams, big ones, bigger than this small house, bigger than me. And I let her believe that she could have them, no matter the cost. When she applied to that prestigious business school, I knew it would stretch us thin, but I also knew she would never be satisfied with anything less. And as her mother, I believed it was my job to give her everything she wanted, even when I had nothing left to give. The letter arrived just before Christmas. Corinne was already home for the holidays, and when she opened the envelope, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. I smiled too, though my chest tightened. "Mom, I got in! I got in!" she squealed, her voice high-pitched with excitement. I held back my tears, masking my fear beneath a proud smile. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, the room too quiet around me. I had promised her father I'd give her everything we couldn't have, everything we couldn't afford. But at what cost? I worked longer hours. I cut corners. I borrowed from one loan to pay another. And when she asked if I was okay, I would smile and say, "I'm fine. We're going to be fine." It became the mantra I repeated to myself every day. But we weren't fine. She didn't know I had sold my wedding ring, the one I'd worn for 20 years through every hardship, every heartbreak. It had become just another piece of jewelry to pawn. I sold it without ceremony, without telling anyone. I pretended it didn't matter. But the truth was, it mattered more than I ever let on. It was all I had left of a life I no longer lived. I hid the ring's absence well. When she asked about it, I told her I had misplaced it. And just like that, the lie became part of the house's quiet fabric, something that no one ever questioned. The loans piled up. I signed them without hesitation, without a second thought. The interest rates climbed higher, but I didn't care. It wasn't about the money. It was about her future, about making sure she had everything I didn't have, about ensuring she had a chance to live a life far better than mine had ever been. She called less. Holidays passed and the phone calls became fewer. It wasn't sudden, but gradual. The distance between us grew, and I told myself it was normal. It was part of growing up. But deep down, I knew I had given her everything, except myself. When she graduated, I was there, sitting in the audience, watching her walk across the stage. She didn't look for me. She didn't even glance in my direction. The whole time I told myself, this is normal. This is what I wanted for her, right? To be independent, to find her place in the world. But the truth settled in my chest like a stone. My sacrifices, my love, all of it didn't matter. She was living her life and I was just a shadow. She never knew the cost of those sacrifices. She thought I liked being busy. That's what I told her. I told her I worked long hours because it made me happy. She never knew that I spent nights crying alone, hoping she would see the truth someday. But she didn't. I protected her from it, from the financial strain, the loneliness, the exhaustion. But all those pieces added up. And in the end, it wasn't just me who paid the price. It was us both. When Corinne came home from school, she was different. She was happy, of course, but there was a distance. I saw it in the way she looked at me when she returned. She was no longer the girl who needed me to tie her shoes or listen to her stories. Now she was the one with her own life, her own future, her own world. I tried to adapt. I told myself I should be proud. But something inside me ached. It was the realization that I had spent my whole life giving her what I never had. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten to give myself the same respect. The woman she had become wasn't someone who needed me anymore. And that's where the distance between us started. Right there. I had always been the one to support her, to build everything for her. But now she stood tall and proud on her own. I felt like I was becoming invisible in my own home. And then came Adrian. He wasn't like anyone she had ever dated. He was polished, successful, and calm. I could tell he calculated things, saw the world in a way that was more pragmatic than emotional. When he married Corinne, I couldn't help but notice something. It wasn't love that brought them together. It was convenience. He married her because she had been raised well, not because he loved her. When they moved back in, it wasn't temporary, as they had said. It became a way of life. My house, my space, my sacrifices became just another part of their world. And me? I became the background. I stayed silent. I let the disrespect pile up, hoping it would change. But deep down, I knew better. The damage was done. And now, I was beginning to see that I had been invisible for a very long time. When Corinne came home from school, it was like the ground shifted beneath me. She was so excited, like she had just discovered a new world that didn't need me. They said it would be temporary, but temporary never lasts, doesn't it? And as I watched them unpack their things into my house, I realized that temporary was just another word for forever. Corinne, radiant in her youth and ambition, had always been the center of my universe. But Adrian, he was a polished stranger, a sharp suit,
a cool smile, and eyes that missed nothing. When he shook my hand, there was a softness to it that almost seemed respectful. But his gaze told another story, one that measured, calculated, and weighed everything.
"I'm sure you've heard about us moving in," Corinne said, as if her excitement could erase the growing discomfort in the room. "It'll just be for a few months until we find a place of our own." I nodded, managing a smile that I hoped didn't betray how much it hurt. She was no longer the little girl who needed me. She was an adult, one who had her own life to live, and I was just supposed to be part of the backdrop. As they settled in, something changed. Slowly, I began to realize that I wasn't even part of their plans anymore. Small, dismissive comments became the new normal. It was as if I wasn't truly seen in my own home. Adrian would comment on the house, saying things like, "You could really do some work on the living room. It's a bit old-fashioned." Or, "The car could use a little updating, don't you think?" I smiled and nodded. I thought about saying something, standing up for myself. But the words felt stuck somewhere between my chest and throat. I had spent so many years trying to protect Corinne from the truth, from my struggles, that I had forgotten how to stand up for myself. At first, I convinced myself that it was just part of being a mother, letting them take over, giving them space, supporting them in every way I could. But then I heard Adrian telling Corinne one evening, "We're getting to the point where we can start looking for houses of our own. I think it's time we talked about getting you out of your mom's place." Those words hit me harder than any argument, any insult. Getting her out of my house. As if my house was never truly my house. Corinne had moved back in, but she wasn't just visiting. She had already started making plans to leave me behind. It was in that moment that I realized she didn't see me as someone who mattered. She saw me as someone who existed only to make her life easier, to smooth out the rough edges of her world. That night, after the last of their unpacked boxes had been shoved into the guest room, I sat alone in the living room, the sound of their voices coming from the kitchen. Their laughter filled the space, but it was distant, detached from me. The house felt too big for just me now, too full of memories I no longer belonged to. But I stayed silent. The silence was familiar now. It was a comfort, even if it was empty. The erosion was slow at first, too slow to notice. A sigh here, a quick dismissal there, a glance that lasted just too long, long enough to remind me that I was no longer part of the equation. Adrian, with his sharp suits and colder charm, was the perfect fit for Corinne's new life. I wasn't part of that life anymore. My advice became old-fashioned, my presence a mere formality. The worst part? The worst part was when I overheard my granddaughter saying, "Grandma talks too much," in that flat, bored voice, as though my stories didn't matter, as though I didn't matter. The words pierced me, but I didn't let them show. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and walked away, making myself small enough to fit in the corners of their perfect life. But then it began to happen more often. The small hurts turned into bigger ones. I wasn't just being ignored anymore. I was being actively erased. One evening, I made a simple suggestion about the garden. I mentioned that the roses would do better if we trimmed them back before the frost. Corinne looked at me, her eyes flat, then turned to Adrian and said, "Mom's just being old-fashioned again. She doesn't know what she's talking about." The words burned, but I stayed quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just nodded, like I always did. Because what was the point? The turning point came quietly. It didn't announce itself with a loud bang or an explosion of anger. It simply happened. One day, Corinne sat down with me after work. She was tired, as we all were, but she had something else in her eyes. There was a disconnect between us now, a distance that stretched longer than either of us were willing to acknowledge. She told me about her plans with Adrian, their future, the house they would buy once they got out of my place. She spoke about it with such ease, as though I would always be here, holding everything together. That's when it hit me. She would always expect me to be there, to hold everything together while she walked away and built her own life without me. The betrayal wasn't loud. It wasn't in her words or in Adrian's dismissive glances. It was the slow, quiet assumption that I would always stay small for them, stay invisible, stay in the background. But I was tired. tired of being the backdrop, tired of being the one who gave and never asked for anything in return. That night, I walked to my room and opened the closet. I pulled out the old metal box, the one that I had hidden away for years, tucked under everything else I owned. Inside were the house deed, the mortgage papers, the car title, and the bank account details. Everything I had worked for, every sacrifice, every penny I had earned, it was all written down here in black and white. And now it was time to take back control. It didn't happen all at once. The betrayal, the growing distance between us, the subtle erosion of respect. It didn't all hit me in a single moment. But Thanksgiving night, with Perrin's careless words hanging in the air, I could feel the weight of everything finally snapping. That dinner, that moment, was the confirmation. It wasn't the first time she had shown disregard for me, but it was the first time I couldn't swallow it anymore. It wasn't the insult that broke me. It was the ease, the way she said it, so casually, as though I were nothing more than background noise in the life she was building for herself. It wasn't even anger that surged within me. It was something quieter, something sharper. Clarity. I stood up from the table and walked out of the room. I didn't look back, not once. I didn't cry in the car, didn't scream at the stars. I simply drove. The world outside the window felt muted, silent almost. The hum of the engine was the only sound as I sped through the darkness, my fingers wrapped tightly around the steering wheel, knuckles white. When I finally arrived home, I didn't feel rage. That's something far more dangerous. Recognition. For years I had given. For years I had sacrificed. But Corinne had forgotten where she came from. She had forgotten who I was. And now she thought my silence was weakness. She thought she could continue to walk all over me because I would never leave. But something inside me shifted that night. The foundation that had once held everything together, her, me, our family, had cracked wide open. I was done being small, done being invisible in my own house. When I returned home, I didn't speak to Corinne. I didn't say a word to Adrian either. I simply walked past them, leaving them to their quiet lives, pretending they hadn't just broken something inside me. They didn't notice. They didn't even care. That was the moment. The moment I stopped pretending. The house felt heavy that night, as though the very walls were pressing in on me. I could still hear the echo of her voice, the dismissive tone that would stay with me forever. I couldn't sleep. How could I, knowing that everything I had given, every sacrifice I'd made, had been thrown aside without a second thought? But I didn't let myself break. I knew what I had to do. I stood up, my feet moving on their own. I didn't need to think about it. I had been preparing for this moment for years, quietly building my strength in ways no one could see. I walked to the back of the closet, to the high shelf where I kept the old metal box, the one no one knew about. It was heavy, weighty with years of secrets and silent decisions. The box was dented and worn, but inside it were the deeds, the documents, and the keys to the life I had created. It was all there. My house deed, the car title, my bank account authorizations, and the loan documents. The loan documents that Corinne thought she could ignore, that Adrian assumed would always be there, supporting them, even when they treated me as invisible. I sat down at the kitchen table, the box in front of me. My hands were steady as I carefully began to sift through the papers inside. There was no emotion here, no regret, just quiet, deliberate action. The mortgage papers, her mortgage papers, were the first ones I focused on. They were in my name, my signature at the bottom of every page. The car, the bank accounts, all of it tied to me. The loans I had signed, the sacrifices I had made, all of it had been for her future, for her success. But it was clear now.
Her success had nothing to do with me anymore. I began calling, not emotional calls, but administrative ones. Quiet, calm, controlled. I called the bank, withdrew my name from the mortgage. I called the car company, and within hours, the luxury SUV, the one I had co-signed for, was scheduled to be towed away. I didn't leave a message. I didn't need to. There was no speech to be made, no dramatic confrontation. I was done with all of that. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming what was mine, what had always been mine. The phone calls continued. I updated my will, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. The estate, everything I had worked for, would no longer go to Corinne. It would go to something more meaningful, a scholarship fund for single parents at Christ Hospital, where I had spent so many years of my life working tirelessly. No longer would my sacrifices go unnoticed. It was done. The house, the car, the money, none of it belonged to her anymore. All those years of being the silent support, the invisible mother, had come to an end. But the real power in all of this wasn't in the money or the possessions. It was in the quiet, strategic moves I had made. I had stopped being the person they relied on, the person who was always there to pick up the pieces. I had taken back my life. And now I waited. The phone calls were the hardest part. At first, there was confusion. Then came anger. But by the time the third voicemail appeared on my phone, I knew what I had to do. "Mom, why are you doing this?" Corinne's voice was frantic, shaky. "The bank is saying we have no access to the account. The car, why are you doing this? We need you. Please, just call me back." I deleted the message. Another came this time from Adrian. "We need to talk. You're ruining us, and I don't understand why. This isn't like you. This isn't who you've been." I deleted it too. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to justify myself. They didn't deserve my explanation. What they needed was to face the truth. I wasn't the person they could use anymore. By the time I'd made the final phone call to the insurance company, I felt nothing but calm. The silence in my house was no longer suffocating. It was empowering. The weight I had carried for years was gone. It was quiet, like the calm before a storm that never comes. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel sad. I just felt clear. I had reclaimed my life, one piece at a time. In the space where the phone calls had been, I began to notice something else. Peace. I had spent years trying to keep everything together for them, for Corinne, for Adrian. But now I could finally feel myself, my own desires, my own wants. And that felt better than any apology I could have ever received. In the days that followed, the world outside my home moved on, but for Corinne and Adrian, nothing was the same. Their calls became desperate, 19 missed calls, then 37, and by the time I reached 60, I knew they were starting to realize the weight of their actions. They thought I'd always be there. They thought my love would always be unconditional. But love isn't enough if you're the only one giving. It wasn't just about what they needed. It was about what I needed, too. And now there was no going back. The phone calls didn't stop coming. The first few were filled with frustration, Corinne's voice cracking, Adrian's clipped, demanding tone. "Why are you doing this? You know we need you. We don't have anything without you." But soon the tone shifted. The anger dissolved into fear. "Mom, please," she said in the next message, "we can't afford the house without you. You've left us in so much debt. Please, please, I'm begging you." I sat in the quiet of my living room, listening to each message. I didn't pick up, not once. The voice of desperation that now echoed through my phone was the same voice that had once dismissed me at Thanksgiving dinner. Now, it was filled with panic, regret, but no apology. And that right there was the final act of betrayal. I had given everything for Corinne. I had sacrificed everything, from my own time to my sense of self. But she never understood the weight of what I had done. She never understood that I was not an endless well to draw from. The silence between us was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was my silence, the silence I had earned. Every missed call was a reminder of the power I now held. Every voicemail, an echo of the lesson I was teaching her. Respect is not a given. It didn't matter how many times she called. The damage had been done. The love I had given for years was now a memory, one that would take more than a few missed calls to fix. The quiet continued, but now it was a different kind of quiet, one that filled me with peace instead of loneliness. I sat at my new apartment, the one by the water, feeling the ocean breeze against my skin as I sat on the balcony. It was calm here. The noise of the city was far away, but more importantly, the noise of my old life felt distant too. No more calls, no more demands, just a quiet, peaceful life, the way it should have been all along.
I had spent years living for others. I had given and given, but in the end, it was clear that I had to live for myself. I wasn't just going to leave Corinne behind. I was going to leave the version of me that had been forgotten. I was going to leave the woman who had been invisible for so long, and in her place, I would become the woman I had always been, but had buried for far too long. It wasn't just about the money or the possessions. It was about freedom. I thought about my old house, the one I had worked so hard for, the one Corinne had taken for granted, the one that had become a symbol of my sacrifices, my invisible labor. Now, it was someone else's burden, someone else's problem. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: relief. I updated my will, and this time, Corinne was not the sole beneficiary. Instead, every cent of my estate was now dedicated to a cause that meant far more to me than anything else: an education fund for single parents at Christ Hospital, where I had spent the better part of my life giving. It was my way of giving back to the world, to those who needed help, not those who took it for granted. As I signed the final papers, I felt the weight of the years lift off my shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, I felt in control. It was a soft knock at the door, not frantic, not desperate, just a quiet sound like the knock of someone who knew they had no right to ask for anything. I opened the door to find Corinne standing there. Her eyes were tired, and her makeup, usually so meticulous, was worn down, as if she had been up for days. She didn't look broken, not in the way I had imagined her when I first made my decision. She looked shaken. "Mom," she said, her voice soft and hesitant, "can we talk?" I stepped aside and let her in, though a part of me wanted to slam the door and turn away, but I didn't. Not yet. She entered slowly, like someone stepping into a church they had left years ago, unsure of what they would find inside. She paused by the window, staring at the ocean for a moment. There was silence between us, not awkward, but heavy. She wasn't ready to face me, not really. She was looking for something, anything, but didn't know how to ask for it. "You really left," she whispered, as if the truth had just settled in her bones. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. My silence had already spoken volumes. "You never thought I'd actually leave," she continued, her voice trembling. I finally spoke. "That's exactly why I did." It wasn't anger or guilt or bitterness. It was just the truth. She looked at me, her face a mixture of disbelief and vulnerability, but the apology was still missing. There were no tears, no pleading for forgiveness. "The house," she said, her voice cracking. "We're losing it. We can't afford it without you." I didn't feel sympathy. I didn't feel anything. She was speaking in the same tone she had always used, assuming I would swoop in, save the day, fix everything. But that's not what I was there for anymore. "I'm sorry, Mom," she finally whispered. The words felt rehearsed, forced, but it was the first time she had said them. But it didn't matter anymore. I didn't rush to offer her comfort. I didn't wrap my arms around her or beg her to stay. For the first time, I realized that her pain was not my responsibility. She needed to face the consequences of her actions. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to let them face them alone. We sat across from each other in the small living room. The silence wasn't awkward now. It was different. Corinne's hands twisted nervously in her lap, and I could see how much she wanted to say something, anything, to fix this. But there were no magic words anymore. No quick fixes. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Mom, I just don't understand. Why are you doing this? I need you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. She had always needed me, but now when I needed her to see me as a person, not just a provider, she couldn't. "You needed me," I said quietly, my gaze fixed on the window. "But I wasn't alive for you. Not really. I was just there, always fixing things, always making sure you had what you needed." Corinne stared at me, her face unreadable for the first time. "I never asked you to do all that, Mom. I never asked for you to sacrifice so much for me." I shook my head, finally turning to face her. "No, you didn't. But I did it because I loved you, and because I thought that's what love was. But it isn't. Love isn't about sacrificing yourself until there's nothing left. It's not about losing who you are just so someone else can grow." She flinched, her eyes beginning to well with tears, but I held up my hand. "Corinne, I'm not angry. I'm not even disappointed. I just need you to understand that respect is the last thing a mother should have to earn. It's not a prize for being good enough. It's a given, because we're people. We're both people, and I deserve that just like anyone else." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her tears had stopped, replaced with a quiet realization, and then the silence stretched again. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't try to convince me I was wrong. Instead, she simply looked at me and nodded once. And in that moment,
For the first time in a long time, I realized something. We were done. But not in a bad way, not in the way I had feared. We were done with the cycle of giving and taking, done with the expectations that kept us trapped in a relationship that wasn't built on mutual respect. The most profound change didn't come from me. It came from Corinne. She had learned something that night, something I couldn't teach her with words. She had learned to face the consequences of her actions without turning away. And that in itself was the beginning of healing. Corinne left my apartment that day with a heavy heart, but it wasn't the weight of guilt or anger that burdened her. It was the weight of truth. She had come to me expecting forgiveness, hoping I would swoop in and fix everything. But she walked away with something far more important, the lesson that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned, just like love. I didn't watch her leave. Instead, I turned back to the window, letting the sound of the waves fill the silence between us. The ocean was always there, always moving. It was constant, just like the way I had once been. But now I was the one who had learned how to flow with life, not against it. I spent the next few weeks in a quiet rhythm. There was something peaceful about the simplicity of my new life. I woke up each day to the soft light streaming through my apartment windows, the scent of salt water in the air. I started my mornings with a walk along the pier, feeling the cool breeze and watching the boats drift across the water. At first, I struggled to adjust. I had spent so many years defining myself through the lens of being needed that without that constant sense of obligation, I wasn't sure who I was anymore.
But soon, I realized that I was more than just a mother, more than just a caretaker. I was a person in my own right, with desires and needs beyond those of anyone else. I volunteered at a local clinic, not because I needed money, but because I wanted to give back. I had spent too many years giving only to Corinne, but now I had the space to give to myself and to others. The work was fulfilling, and the people I met helped me see the world through a different lens. I wasn't invisible here. I was seen for who I truly was, a woman with her own voice, her own purpose. In the evenings, I would sit on my balcony, sipping tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It wasn't just the end of the day. It felt like the end of an old chapter of my life. The woman who had been so desperate to hold everything together, to sacrifice everything for her daughter, was now gone. In her place was someone who had found herself again, who understood that silence could be a form of strength, not weakness. The beauty of this new life was that it wasn't perfect. It didn't have to be. I wasn't waiting for things to be right anymore. I was simply living, existing, and allowing myself to be. For the first time, I felt free. The world I had once inhabited, the world where I was invisible, where my existence was defined by what I gave, seemed so distant now. I had finally stepped away from the role of the perpetual giver. But for Corinne and Adrienne, the fallout was just beginning. The missed calls, the endless texts demanding answers, slowly turned into frustration. They realized that their lives had been built on the support I had provided. Without me, the foundation was crumbling. I didn't answer their calls, not a single one. Instead, I watched from a distance as they grappled with the consequences of their actions. They were faced with the reality of how much they had taken for granted. The house they once called home was being repossessed. The car was gone. The debts I had quietly cleared from my life were now their burdens to bear. But I didn't interfere. I wasn't the one who had caused this. I was merely the one who had stopped enabling it. The truth had to hit them as hard as it had hit me when I had finally realized that love without respect was just self-erasure. The natural consequences of their entitlement were unfolding, but I wasn't there to soften the blow anymore. I wasn't there to step in and fix what they had broken.
But even as Corinne and Adrienne faced the unraveling of their world, I remained untouched by it. This was their journey now. My role was no longer to be their fixer. It was to be me, the woman who had walked away not out of anger, but out of the quiet knowledge that I was worth more than they had ever shown me. Months passed, and in that time, I settled into my new life as though it had always been meant for me. I had stopped waiting for someone to need me, stopped expecting someone to understand the depth of what I had given. Instead, I gave to myself. I walked along the pier at sunrise, letting the world wake up around me, and I listened to the rhythm of my own life. One afternoon, after I had finished a shift at the clinic, I came home to find a letter waiting for me. It was from Corinne. The letter was short, filled with apologies and promises. She said she understood now, that she had learned what she had never learned before, that love is not a one-sided affair. She wrote about the mistakes she had made, how she had taken me for granted, how she had never truly seen me. She begged me to call her, to help her rebuild. I read it. Twice. And then I folded it up and placed it in the drawer. I didn't respond. And in that moment, I realized that my silence wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a form of cruelty. It was peace. It was the last lesson I needed to teach her, and perhaps the most important one, that sometimes silence isn't about avoiding a confrontation. Sometimes silence is how we reclaim our own power. As I stood by my window, watching the waves crash against the rocks, I finally understood. This was how I had learned to rise. By leaving behind the parts of me that had been erased, that had been invisible for too long, I had reclaimed everything they had taken for granted. And with that, I had given myself the greatest gift of all, my own life. I wasn't her mother anymore. I was me, and that was enough. When I looked in the mirror now, I didn't see the woman I had been, the one who had been invisible, the one who had given everything without question. I saw someone different, a woman who had learned to love herself, to stop sacrificing for others at the expense of her own happiness. And in that mirror, I saw my own reflection, for the first time, clear and true. My silence took everything they took for granted and gave me back my life. Sometimes silence isn't about retreating, it's about reclaiming. And in that silence, I found my strength. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was mine. If you've ever given until you disappeared, remember this. Love does not mean abandoning yourself, and silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is how we rise. Tell us in the comments, have you ever loved someone who forgot